noticing this little girl down here. I don't know her name. I'm the son of a man who taught music for 14 years at Mount Ellis Academy, and I'm the youngest of three. And I was supposed to be musical. Maybe I have a touch of it, I don't know. But I was a reluctant reader. When I was in the first grade, I didn't want to learn to read. I'm not sure exactly why, but for some reason I didn't want to learn to read. And my teacher did everything in her power to convince me that this was a skill that I would need eventually in life and that I needed to practice. Well, eventually I started to catch on a little bit. And as I was looking at the hymnal one day, standing by my father, and was trying to sing along, and I had begun to learn how to read a little bit, I noticed Dad was singing the wrong words. Because, you know, if you look at a hymnal, it has a row of words, and then a row of words, and then a row of words. And when I was learning to read, that was the way it's supposed to go, you know. And here Dad was singing something that wasn't at all what was on there, and I poked him, my elbow. And, what are you singing, Dad? Well, it goes like this, and then he pointed, just like you were doing for your granddaughter, I assume, and pointed to the words and how you go down to the next verse. I began at approximately 7 or 8 years old to learn how to read music. And it's a great skill to have. I just couldn't help notice that today as I was sitting here watching that. I remembered me learning how to read music and learning how to read. My poor teacher, she struggled. We moved the next year, and we moved to Caldwell, Idaho, where my father was the builder for Gem State Academy, one of the builders. And I went up to my teacher. Her name was Mrs. Grove. I met her at a potluck, church potluck out in the park. And I walked up to her and I said, "Hi, Mrs. Grove. My name's Gary Way, and I understand you're going to be my teacher. And I'm not a very good reader." And she put her hand on my shoulder. She said, "We'll see about that." And after that first year there at Caldwell, Mrs. Grove inspired me to become a reader, and so I learned how to read. And she inspired me to be a teacher. This is in Mark. I read part of it. It's in Mark 9. Starting with verse 30. Mark 9:30. Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know it. For he taught his disciples and said to them, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day." But they did not understand this saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then he came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent. For on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Is it possible? Is it possible to be a saint and to be a sinner with a known, persistent sin? With all the talk about perfection floating around, which in the sense of perfection as being completely committed to the will of God, we should desire and reach for it, I would suggest that there are examples in the Bible of people who were walking with God, who were engaging in persistent sin. When I went to a school where I taught in Wisconsin, I was the upper grades teacher. I taught grades 5 through 8, and there was a lady there who taught grades 1 to 4, and she was the principal. One day, she came hurried into my office, and she said, Mr. Way, I've got to leave, and I've got to go for about a half hour, and then it's recess time. Could you take your kids out with my kids at the same time and go monitor recess out on the lawn? And they can play together while I run and do something I have to take care of. I said, sure. So I dismissed my class, and they went out the front door, and I went to her classroom and ushered the grades 1 to 4 out the back door, and we created a giant game of dare base, and we were having a great time. And I kept watching the clock in the parking lot in hopes that she would show up, and pretty soon the clock got a little bit farther and a little bit too far, and I thought, well, I'll just take them all in. We'll have school in one room. I've done that before. And so I sent my 5 through 8 in, and I had my 1st through 4th graders line up, because 1st through 4th graders, if you don't line them up, when you get in the classroom, you'll have a little chaos. So I lined up my 1st through 4th graders, and as one of the kids was getting in line, as they were getting in line, one of them ran up to this little girl. She had this beautiful long curly hair, and he hit her just as hard as he could hit her, right square in the back, just bam. And he was a big boy, and he was in the 4th grade, and I walked over and I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, exactly why did you do that? And this little girl, she was standing there, you could tell she was just about ready to cry, and she was wincing, but she was gritting her teeth. And I said, why'd you do that? And he said, that's my place in line. And I said, well, she got here first. What's the deal? Well, I'm supposed to be first. And I said, well, exactly why are you supposed to be first? Because I called it. I said, oh, this is a rule I didn't know. Well, we'll have to talk with your teacher about this. And I think you'll have to stay after school with the teacher today, because this is not acceptable for you to do that, and you'll need to apologize. Well, we went in, but I thought, isn't that humanity? I want to be first in line. If I don't get to be first in line, and every Thanksgiving I watch a little football. We're inspired with who's going to win, who's going to be first. who's going to come out on top. I love professional baseball, and I watch the statistics all summer long. The Royals deserve it after 30 years, but yeah, I would like the Cubbies to have made it. It all began with Lucifer. He wanted to be on top, and it's part of our nature. We want to be first. And the disciples had the same problem. How did Jesus treat known sinners? How does Jesus treat known sinners? Again, I ask the question, is it possible for saints to sin? Oh, sure, we make mistakes. I'm Norwegian, and I've got this little temper, you know how Norwegians are. How does Jesus treat saints who sin? Is it possible to sin and to know you are sinning and keep on doing what you're doing wrong and still be a Christian? Well, here's Jesus walking down the road in our story that I just read. And he's out ahead of the disciples. And they start a discussion, and they've kind of lagged back because they know that it's not really going to work out really well to talk about what they want to talk about and have Jesus here. They've been with Jesus about 3 years. Often they've declared their faith in him. But at this time they're lagging behind because what they want to talk about is a topic that isn't one they want Jesus to hear. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to sin when you're in the presence of someone you love? When I first took off to college, when I was 19, I got into things that were unacceptable for a Christian to be involved in. And at the end of 2 years, I had a 1.2 GPA. And I majored in hair and rook. And I hadn't accomplished a great deal. I decided to drop out of college, and I really wasn't capable of handling the academic world. I went home to live with my parents, get a job in construction, and I would move on, and I would develop a career in the world of construction. Well, I discovered at home it was a whole lot harder being in the presence of my parents to carry on the lifestyle I had started in college. It's hard to see it in the presence of someone you love. And so the disciples lagged behind. When they got to the house, Jesus asked them, what have you been talking about? Have you ever noticed, and we were talking about this in the Sabbath school class, have you ever noticed that when God approaches us when we're in the wrong, that he asks a question? Have you ever noticed that? When Adam and Eve sinned, where are you, Adam? Where are you? When Cain had killed his brother, God came to Cain and said, where is your brother? I can't find him. Never does he come to us and say, Adam, why did you eat that apple? Adam, you have sinned, and this is ridiculous. A friend of mine who was a principal tells this story. He was principal of a big school, about 600 elementary kids. And one day, a teacher came in, hurrying in and said, Tim is going to be in your office in a few minutes, And I need you to sit down and talk to him, and I've written out here on the piece of paper what he's done so you can take care of it. And she handed him a piece of paper, and no sooner than she was out the door, he sat down behind his desk and he started to read the paper, and just then the phone rang and he was called out of the office, and he took out of the office. And he was gone for about an hour and a half, and he came back to the office, and here was Timmy sitting in the office. And he reached in his pocket to get that piece of paper, and it was gone. He reached in his other pocket. Timmy, what are you here for exactly? Can you tell me? And Timmy began to just pour out his little heart. And he told all kinds of things that weren't even on the list. And that's the way God is with us. What did you do? Tell me. So Jesus, at the end of this, at the house, he says, what were you talking about on the way? Jesus had tried to teach them over and over that true greatness is humility. But they hadn't learned. How many times have you set a child in the midst of them and said, unless you become his children, you cannot enter the kingdom? But it had not sunk in. If I had been Jesus at this point, I'd have said, my time is short. Lord, I need another 12. I've been teaching for 30 years, and there are times when I think I'd like another group. But no, Jesus sets a child up, and he does not condemn them. He, again, teaches them. He continued to walk with them, to fellowship with them, to work with them, to travel, and to entrust them with his work and mission. They were guilty of sin, the sin of pride. Everyone has pride. That's what Monopoly is based on. My brothers and I have two older brothers, we used to sit around the table and we'd have a piece of Mom's beautiful big homemade bread slice. We would cover that with thick peanut butter. Build a little wall around the outside edge of it that would be about this high. And then we would make a little pattern inside with like a little rice patty, and then we would fill all of that with honey. We would see who could get the deepest amount of honey. We would compete over just a piece of bread. Who could do the best? Who could get the most? How many times have I stood in a supermarket line, and here's a mother with her two children, and one of them is holding on to this new toy that they have. That's mine, says the other. Give it back. Mom said we had to share. Pride is part of us. It's in every one of us. But we say, well, sanctification is a work of a lifetime. Well, maybe about the time I die, I'm going to get over pride. Ellen White tells us that pride is the worst sin. It is the hardest to give up. It is the most offensive to God because it is contrary to his nature. Pride started the whole mess. I'm an English teacher. And many stories and books that I teach have in it a hero. Usually it's a tragic hero. One of them is Ahab in the story Macbeth. And his fatal flaw was his pride. He held his fist up at one incident and said, if the wind thinks it can outdo me. Forget it. I'm going to get that way. Macbeth dies because of his pride. The disciples persisted with this question. It began early in their walk. James and John's mother came to Jesus and said, when you finally set up your kingdom, which one of these boys will sit on your right and which one on your left? A little while before the crucifixion, the discussion is still going on, who's going to be the greatest. At the Last Supper, that's their discussion. They were engaging in sin, known, continuous, habitual, cherished sin. Jesus treats sinning sinners who know they are sinners and keep right on sinning. Well, we say, well, they weren't converted. Those disciples weren't quite converted yet. But they had cast out demons, healed lepers, raised the dead. And Jesus had said of them in Luke 10:20, rejoice, because your names are written in heaven. They weren't converted. How does Jesus treat disciples who are quietly guilty of known sin? Matthew 12:31 tells us all manner of sin shall be forgiven unto men. That includes known, continuous, habitual, cherished, persistent sin of pride. Jesus continued to walk with them. We could conclude, well, sin isn't all that bad. We don't really need to overcome. Within the story of Mary comes to mind. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Jesus provides the power to overcome. He provides it through forgiveness for the weak, immature, growing disciples. The growing Christian. How is this power provided? The book Steps to Christ in the first chapter. It begins not with you are a sinner, but it begins with the incredible love of God. That power is provided through the acceptance of that love. But continued relationship, traveling, talking, listening, the sinning sinner can count on acceptance as he or she learns about the power that is available. It is the person who knows he's loved and accepted is the one who grows out of sin. Well, some might say, well, this is license. No, it is not. The relationship leads to victory. We can conclude that it is possible to have a relationship with God and having known sin at the same time the disciples did. With Jesus engaging in pride, as long as you maintain the relationship with God, as long as you maintain the relationship with God, sooner or later the sin or the relationship will go. Judas understood, and he scrapped the relationship. When you scrap the relationship with Jesus in favor of known sin, you're on dangerous ground. Well, I don't want to be too religious. my lifestyle might have to change. But John, the disciple that was especially close to Jesus, had the same problem that Judas had. But he stayed with Jesus. And years later, the last of the disciples, all the rest are martyrs, John says in 1 John 4:7, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And one of his friends says to him, John, you've changed. And John says, who, me? Those who change are caught up in a relationship and are unaware of their own transformation. If you continue by the side of Jesus through prayer and Bible study, walking, talking, living, nothing takes you from his side, sin will fade unwittingly. Sometimes we get impatient. But remember my garden. This year I planted a hill of zucchini. And we all know that zucchini are prolific little plants. In fact, you probably had a box or two of zucchini out in the entrance of the church in hopes that somebody would take it, because your zucchini plant was still producing even late into the summer, since we've had such a late fall. Well, for some reason, this zucchini plant that I planted this year produced one zucchini fairly early. It grew from about this long to about this long in 3 weeks. But this is not a normal zucchini. Something is wrong with this zucchini. Finally, it got fat and stayed stubby, and I just gave up on it and plucked it off, and then all of a sudden the plant took off. Ellen White uses this illustration about the gardener to illustrate that when we get impatient, remember that there are stages in development. How does Jesus treat saints who are sinners? He asks a question. He teaches a lesson with the child. He walks with us. He puts his trust in us. He forgives and challenges us to walk and talk with him. Our closing hymn